Hi everyone, unfortunately maybe a bit of an angry one today. This will be a little bit different than usual, but I would really love to hear your thoughts on this one. I'm going to try and remain as composed as I can throughout this one, but this is quite an emotive topic for me. A few people have been in contact with me regarding a video that someone called Paul Thorpe recently put out about the state of the UK and youth violence, and they wanted to know my thoughts on it. There'll be a link in the description below to Paul's video, so you can check that out in its entirety if you so wish. So firstly, let me position myself in this for those who don't know much about me. I work for a couple of different services and also privately for myself. I have a part-time role within a youth justice service where my job is to assess the needs of a young person who has come into the service and to try and understand what has led them to offend, as we tend to see offending behaviour as a symptom of an underlying need for that child that isn't being met. If the underlying need is trauma related, and it most often is, then I offer intervention through the form of therapy for that child to help improve their life and to reduce offending. So that's one side of my professional practice. On the other side, there's more general mental health help for children and young people for a wide range of presentations that something like CBT or EMDR might help with. And because I'm known for working with trauma, I usually get trauma-related presentations. And sometimes these presentations are a result of either violence, so some form of assault or threat, or the fear of violence. So I see both sides of this in my day-to-day clinical work. So that's my professional life. I also obviously have a personal life where I am a human being who has the full range of emotions that human beings have, and they can be quite extreme at times. I'm also a father to 2 children who are now becoming more independent and venturing out without me. So Paul's video included another video that he was referring to. And what I would like to do now is play that video for you so you have an understanding of what we are talking about here.
So yesterday I get a phone call from my youngest daughter and she says, "Dad, I'm feeling really upset, really disturbed." I said, "What's the matter?" She said, "I've seen this video on TikTok and it's just like done my head in." And I said, "Well, send it to me, let's have a look." So let's have a little look at the video that upset us so much.
So they saw him walking alone. We live in a very small village, so this is not a major city. It was in the middle of the day as well, and they saw him walking alone across a field, and they all turned on their telephones to video it on social media, live on social media.
They live streamed it?
Yes, this group charged my son. He was alone, defenceless. They charged him. There was a group of about 9 of them. And as soon as he saw them coming, he just froze. They were all hooded, had masks on, and he just fell to the ground in fear. Makes me really emotional talking
Sandy,
about it.
I can't imagine. How old is your son at this point?
He was just a teenager. He was 15. He was 15, and he was walking across a field to go and meet a girl. So it was just awful. So this group charged him. On the video, you see him fall to the floor, just in fear, pure fear. They all circle around him and they all start kicking him. And then this small boy, you just see him on the corner of the screen run in, and something happens. You can't see it very clearly on the video. I've had to watch this. The police showed it to me, and it was just the most horrific thing I've ever seen in my life. And you see this small boy kind of come in from the side of the screen, run in, and then everybody disperses really quickly. It's the bizarrest thing to watch. And my son's still on the floor in the fetal position, and you see the wobbling of all the cameras as everyone's running away. They didn't know if my son was alive or dead at that point, and they just videoed it and put it all over the internet. The perpetrator was identified because he was the smallest of the group, so from the video, he was able to be identified who he was. He admitted to the attack of stabbing my son, and he was asked to write a letter of apology. That was his punishment.
Not really.
I swear, the court ordered him to write a letter of apology, and there was a £50 fine attributed to the case. That was the justice that my son got.
I honestly, something is going very, very badly wrong. Very, very badly wrong in this country. If a 15-year-old boy can be stabbed in the head, left for dead, bleeding at the side of the road, and a letter of apology and a £50 fine is considered it. That, honestly, that is one of the most astonishing calls I've ever taken, and frankly has left me utterly speechless.
My very first reaction to this is one of anger. Anger for many reasons. Anger that this attack happened in the first place. This boy couldn't even go and meet a girl without being attacked. What should have been an exciting moment in his life. Anger at the filming it and streaming it, which would likely be used to ridicule later on, to cause shame purposely. Anger at the ages of the people involved. These are all children. Anger that the victim was just left. And I have fear that this could happen to my children, who are at the age now of meeting up with friends in parks, and I might not be able to be there to protect them. There's anger at the court system, who felt that a £50 fine and an apology letter was an appropriate way of dealing with this. I have some frustration that I don't know more about what happened. Was a £50 fine and an apology the actual only outcome, or is there some form of rehabilitation and youth justice service involvement taking place? Those are my initial reactions. And my first reaction seemed to be very similar to Paul's daughter's reaction, who said that she had alerted him to the video because it made her feel upset. It made her feel disturbed and distressed. And Paul's sentiment appears to be along the same lines as what is said in the comments, and also what I hear from other people in my day-to-day life. Paul said he wanted to find the original story so he could find this mother and talk to her for himself. And he says this:
it makes my blood boil. So I decided to try and find this family. I decided to try and Google this crime. And I typed in 15-year-old boy stabbed in a park, etc., etc. I tried all the different terms, teenagers stabbed in park, etc. And I couldn't find it. And you know why I couldn't find it? Because there are hundreds of them. Go and look for yourselves. Type in
My Google skills are pretty good for finding specific information. I couldn't find it either. Like Paul says, there are just too many search results for looking for incidents like this. It's shocking. So something we need to ask ourselves is knife crime on the rise? Or is it just being reported more? And there's various statistics we can use to look at this. So broadly speaking, if we listen to the Youth Justice Board from their stats published in 2023, this shows that first-time entrants, so children new to the justice system, was at an all-time low. The number of children in custody was at an all-time low, and reoffending is at an all-time low. And more specifically about knife crime, we see that 97% of knife or offensive weapon offences committed by children were possession offences. Now, this obviously doesn't include children who haven't been caught. And this number is 3% lower than it was 10 years ago, which is the fourth consecutive year-on-year decrease. Now, I find this stat hard to think about. is the decrease due to less possession? So there's actually less people carrying. Or are there other reasons like less police doing stop and searches and actually finding them? However, let's look at some stats from the Youth Endowment Fund, who are an organisation that tries to prevent children and young people becoming involved in violence. They looked at police data that showed that knife violence has increased over the past decade. What they found was knife crime increased by 90% between 2012 and 2019 in England and Wales. It fell in 2020, 2021 due to lockdowns and social distancing measures, but it has since increased and it is now 75% higher than it was in 2012. Another stat we could look at is the number of people admitted to hospital for injuries from being assaulted with a knife or a sharp object. And if we take a look at this, then we can see an increase of 31% from 2012 to 2018. Just prior to lockdowns, numbers were starting to fall. They continued to fall over lockdowns and continue to fall with lockdowns being lifted. So we're at the stage where it's 5% lower than 10 years ago. So what we see is that knife crime is rising, but people being hospitalised is falling. And looking at hospital admissions are useful as they capture when someone is injured badly enough to have to go to hospital. They also don't rely on the incident being reported to the police. However, that data is reliant on hospitals recording it properly when someone attends, and it may also be impacted by other factors. How about we look at deaths that are attributed to a knife or a sharp object? We see a peak before the pandemic with numbers being up by 46% in 2017 compared with 5 years earlier in 2012. Then in 2019 and 2020, we see that falling, with lockdowns brought a big fall in the numbers. However, that bounced back as soon as lockdowns were lifted. And the latest figures show numbers are down again. However, they are still 20% higher than they were 10 years ago. So what we can see from this, no matter how you want to interpret them, is that knife crime is still far too high. Let me know what you think about these stats. Are they surprising to you? Are they what you expected? Tell me your thoughts. Just one more thing to look at, and this really hammers it home, is the Ben Kinsella Trust's website. If you want an easy to read overview of the latest stats, then you can find them there. And looking at the top comments, and going back to Paul's video, looking at the top comments on his video, we can see things like a £50 fine and a sorry letter for stabbing a 15-year-old kid. Any judge who thinks this was a fitting punishment must be removed from their position. It's disgusting. The only people who are going to look after us is us. The police are a waste of time and the judicial system is bollocks. It's about time we started fighting back, an eye for an eye. As an ex-soldier, it pains me to see what this country has become, and I absolutely dread to think where it is going. They just don't give a shit about any of us. You nailed it. 17-year-old boy stabbed to death in Northern Ireland last weekend. It's disgusting that the criminal justice system puts the criminal before the victim and the rest of society. Years ago, I watched a mate of mine who'd been stabbed to death, buried by his mother. Next year, the guy who killed him will be free, still plenty young, able to go sit in a deck chair at the beach, go to pubs, clubs, restaurants, eat across from you and your family without you knowing. As a parent now seeing the UK justice system, it baffles me why murdering isn't an all-life sentence. In some countries, you'd face a firing squad. All it says to parents is, if someone kills your child, take revenge if you want justice. The UK's empathy and kindness is our greatest weakness. The UK is doomed. Speechless. I've literally just had a £100 fine for accidentally forgetting to tax a car I've just purchased, and I've got to fill in a form with a detailed explanation as to why I didn't pay. A worse punishment than attempted murderer received. And Paul's thoughts are the same.
What has happened to this country, our police and our criminal justice system, when people feel that they can go around doing this stuff to their fellow human beings without seemingly any recourse? In this case, a £50 fine and a letter of apology. Why didn't the judge just stick another knife into that poor boy's mother? Honestly, I'm just almost lost for words. Make of it what you will. Tell me what you think. Am I right? Am I wrong? Have we completely and utterly lost the goddamn plot in this country? Have we gone mad? Are victims no longer cared for? The victims no longer matter?
And thinking about my own experience and my own clinical work outside of the youth justice system, this is what I see. I see children and young people who are telling me they don't feel safe. Some of them don't feel safe walking to school. Some of them don't feel safe going to local towns. Some don't feel safe going to local parks to socialise with their friends. Not only do they think they're going to get attacked, they think it's going to be broadcast all over social media where it will just live forever and be a constant reminder and a constant source of shame. So how do they cope with this? There seems to be 3 ways that I've seen in my practice. The first way is that they weigh up the likelihood of this happening or not, and they do that based on where they are going, who they are going with, how long they're going to be, those sort of things. And generally speaking, they don't have any problems. The second way they are dealing with this is by not going out. So it's avoidance, not going to school. And this leads to social isolation, anxiety, depression. And a lot of the time, it is the fear of it happening. It's not through direct experience. So I'm not even talking about the people that this has happened to or have witnessed it themselves, but from what they have seen in social media and heard from others. The pandemic hit young people hard in terms of lockdowns. They don't want to now be feeling unsafe in their local communities. And I had a quick look to see if I could find any data on children who were too scared to go out. And I did find some. I found some data that said 1 in 5 children had skipped school in the previous 12 months due to feeling unsafe. That 1 in 5 amounts to over 700,000 13 to 17-year-olds. 47% of children said that violence or the fear of violence had affected them in some other way. 18% couldn't concentrate at school. 19% have difficulty sleeping. 26% isolated themselves. 20% spent more time online now instead of going out. And the third way is that children are now carrying protection themselves. So you now end up with more knives and weapons on the street. And I can see various comments about that in Paul's video. Tool up, people. I'd rather be judged by a Freemason Satanist judge and 12 morons than be carried by 6 friends. I'm always equipped as I can be when I go out. There is nothing else I can do. I will try my damn hardest to defend my life. I don't want my children feeling this way. I don't want any child to feel this way. Before I came into the job that I currently do within youth justice, I had very little empathy and understanding, really, for the other side of this, for the children who are offending. But that's changed, and I want to share some of my experience with you. Now, I'm going to be really clear here. I personally don't think this absolves anything. People still have responsibility and accountability for their actions. What I'm talking about here is having an understanding about why this might be happening and the underlying issues below the offending scene on the surface. I can tell you that most, not all, but most of the children I work with in this way are some of the most abused and traumatized children I've ever worked with. Most of these children have experienced domestic abuse, often very violent, physical, sexual, neglect, emotional abuse. We know from the trauma literature this impacts attachment in relationships. It can manifest as physical problems, difficulty with emotional regulation, dissociation, behavioural regulation, difficulty with cognition, so the ability to make decisions, and impacts their self-identity and self-concept. And the treatment or the intervention for this, well, that starts with consistent and continuing care from adults, which frankly these children don't have or don't get. A lot of these children are looked after by the local authority, meaning they have been removed from their parents and are most likely living in what are known as residential placements. A lot of their parents are traumatised themselves, so there's a transgenerational trauma element going on. A lot of them aren't in any form of education and haven't been for some time. And if they aren't in school, then they have little structure to their day. There's nowhere for them to go, as a lot of the youth centres and hubs have been closed down over the years. They have very little in the way of pro-social peer or adult support. In fact, there's research that says that 78% of children in a youth justice service who committed violent offences were also victims of violent offences themselves. Substance misuse is very high. Most of them have very little concept of self-identity, and they tend to gravitate toward children in a similar position. They leave themselves very vulnerable and open to exploitation through things like county lines and gangs, where they get a glimmer of what it's like to fit in with something, and then they want more of that despite the risks. Some of these children have undiagnosed neurodevelopmental problems or difficulties. Sorry if I'm using the wrong language there. And again, that leaves them very vulnerable to being manipulated. And should the severity of previous experiences be a mitigating circumstance for the sentence? So should a child who has had more trauma in their life, should they receive a lesser sentence than a child who hasn't had as much trauma? And how do we measure that? How do we decide that? Or do we not even take that into consideration at all? Do we base it on, here's an offence and here is the sentence? And I know there's sentencing guidelines that are used. I'm talking more, what are your thoughts? What are your opinions on this? I'd love to know. I'm not convinced that harsher sentences will be much of a deterrent. Broadly speaking, when we think of sentencing, we think of three considerations: punishment, deterrence, and rehabilitation. And generally speaking, youth justice, rehabilitation is given the greatest weight. So practically speaking, with this small boy mentioned in the video, you end up with this continuum of protecting the public from harm and a welfare approach for what is essentially a child who most likely has suffered themselves, and whether that can be treated or offered intervention so it doesn't happen again. Now, I guess one solution is the person goes to custody to protect the public from harm, and whilst in custody, there is rehabilitation, there is mental health support, there's substance misuse support, there's work around processing earlier trauma, those kind of things. But I don't have any experience of custody. I don't know what it is really like there for those children. What I do know is that 30% of children who come out of custody go on to re-offend. So clearly for a third of children, either custody isn't enough of a deterrent, or they didn't get the support they needed, either during custody or after custody. And should there be equivalence between the offence and the sentence? It feels like there should be. It feels like the sentence should be appropriate and proportional to the offence. So it feels like what is being said here is that the suffering that child went through is the equivalent of £50 and an apology. And that to me doesn't match up. Again, I want to reiterate that I'm not making excuses for these children. It's more about trying to understand what is going on. If that was my child And the person who did that, child or not, was fined £50 and an apology letter. And thankfully I've never had to experience that, and hopefully I never will. I would be absolutely raging. It would be very, very hard to have any empathy or compassion at all. My emotional brain would take complete control, or not control, I guess, of what I was experiencing. I'm pretty sure that would happen. And I know that might seem at odds with everything that I've just said, but these things aren't easy to navigate and make sense of. I could talk at length about this topic. I could talk about the morals and ethics around justice and the decision-making process. I could talk about some of my own original research where I've talked to people who work within these systems, and they are very, well, not all of them, but a lot of them get very, very conflicted themselves about working with children who have done or who have committed some very serious crimes and the impact it has on them, as in the worker. The levels of burnout, the levels of secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, and moral injury. I don't know what the solution is. And to some extent, I agree with Paul and the title of his video. I think the UK is currently fucked. But I think it is far wider than just youth violence. I think that perhaps youth violence is a result of many things. Youth violence is a symptom of an underlying wider problem. And that is what needs to be targeted. So a bit of a rant today, I'm afraid. Something a bit different. Let me know what you think about all of this. Do you think that harsher sentences would improve things? Where should we be pointing the finger? If you live in another country, what's happening there? Do you see the same problems? Maybe there's been some improvement, and if there has been, how did that come about? I've got loads of videos coming up soon about overcoming developmental trauma. So if that is something that interests you, then please stay tuned. Consider subscribing if you want to support the channel and this work. Thank you. Take care. Goodbye.